I just love mnemonics. I've used them a lot, and sometimes if I haven't been told a mnemonic, I've been guilty of making up my own mnemonics. What is a mnemonic? That's something that helps you to remember. And all of us probably have been taught Roy G. Biv to remember the colors in the spectrum of the rainbow for red, orange, yellow, Roy, green, blue, indigo, violet. We have that mnemonic, and it helps us to remember the order in the rainbow. Our topic today is also something that's been addressed by a mnemonic. We want to talk about the order of operations, and the teachers that came before me used a mnemonic, and it has been passed down. Only trouble is, what good is a mnemonic if you don't really know what it means? And a lot of times students tell me the mnemonic. In the first few years that I was teaching, I assumed that since they knew the mnemonic, they actually knew the order of operations. And every time I was completely disappointed when I would actually test them on the application of the mnemonic, because they would get it all wrong. So we want to make sure that we understand the mnemonic for order of operations. Now, I brought something to help you remember. Why do we have to have order of operations? Why can't we just do what we like? Oh, I wanted to say, every once in a while I see on Facebook somebody posts a long arithmetic problem, lots of operations, and they ask the number, and it always astounds me the number of people who submit their answers and how many of them are wrong. So we have not been very successful at teaching the order of operations. I think everybody thinks they know, but they don't. So please pay attention. Now, I brought this sword here as a memory device because maybe you remember, maybe you don't. There used to be a show, a television show, and there were movies called The Highlander. I don't understand it because the actors in there didn't look like anything like my relatives, who are all Scottish, all my aunts and uncles. But they had this show. There was a premise that there were some sort of immortal people, but they had this thing that there could only be one, and the show always ended with two of these sort of tentatively immortal people would get out their swords, and then the statement was, there could only be one, or there can be only one, or there can only be one, or something. So they had to fight because there could only be one of these immortal people, or whatever they called them. Anyway, I've got this sword here because when you have a math problem, there can only be one way to get the proper results. I mean, there might be different ways to do the problem, but there can only be one end result, and there has to be rules. You can't have it be, well, do whatever you want with the operations, because that would end in different results. And if you're trying to calculate the length of girders for a bridge, there can only be one answer. Or if you're trying to determine how much flour you need to run your restaurant, there can only be one answer if you give a long string of arithmetic commands. Now, the mnemonic that came down to me was, my dear Aunt Sally. And my teacher said, multiply, divide, add, and subtract. By the time I started teaching, my students corrected me, and they always said, please, my dear Aunt Sally, because that would mean powers, multiply, divide, add, and subtract. And then it became, pretty please, my dear Aunt Sally, the evolution of a mnemonic, which they said parentheses powers, multiply, divide, add, and subtract. And when students would say to me, pretty please, my dear Aunt Sally, I'd say, oh, you were taught this. That didn't mean they knew. So we need to correct something. Now, I was told in education classes that it takes 6 times as much energy to get something out of your head that you have in there incorrectly as it does to learn something new. And I imagine from my experience as a teacher for over 35 years that many of you have this wrong, even though you know the mnemonic. See, the problem is, there's nothing wrong. Parentheses do come first. Anything in parentheses, you do the inside the parentheses first. And if there's parentheses inside of parentheses, you work your way inside out. That's not the problem. then there comes, let's see, powers. Powers control only the number or quantity that comes immediately before them. That's not the problem. The problem comes when we deal with multiply and divide and add and subtract. Now, what I need for you to know is that multiplication and division are the same thing. When you multiply, you're doing your multiply. But when you divide, you're multiplying by the reciprocal. So to divide by 2 is to multiply by 1/2. So multiply and divide are really the same operation in disguise. Same with adding and subtracting. When you subtract, you're really adding the opposite. So when you've got your mnemonic and you go, my dear Aunt Sally, there really aren't 4 things. There are only 2. There's multiply and divide, and then add and subtract. And those things are the same. So, you see, you do have to multiply and divide, but it doesn't matter. You don't do all the multiplying and then do all the dividing. You do the multiplying and dividing as you bump into them as you go left to right. And when you're done with multiplying and dividing, then you do adding and subtracting. But since they're the same thing, you do adding and subtracting left to right as you bump into them because they are the same operation. So we're going to look at some examples, and I hope that this might clear this up. You need to test yourself and make sure that you do know the order of operations. I have a program that asks you to figure out what's the next operation that you have to do. While I'm here talking about mnemonics, I want to talk to you about another mnemonic. It hasn't come down as popularly as my dear Aunt Sally. When I was in 8th grade, one day my 8th grade arithmetic teacher, Mr. Bowden, who was so old, he had actually taught my father when he was a boy. And he was kind of old, but kind of knew everything. He came in one day and he said, I am so tired of you kids writing arithmetic on your paper and spelling it wrong. So let's learn how to spell it. And he said to us, a rat in Tom's house might eat Tom's ice cream. He only said it once. After that, I knew how to spell arithmetic. A rat in Tom's house might eat Tom's ice cream. For 60 years, I've spelled arithmetic correctly. It's one of the few words I do get right. I spelled arithmetic correctly, but I cannot write it without saying to myself, a rat in Tom's house might eat Tom's ice cream. Maybe you need that mnemonic. But let's look at the order of operations for adding, subtracting, multiplying, and dividing, and powers, so that we can get this straightened out. Oh, I did want to say one other thing. We have to understand order of operations for math. If some of you become computer programmers, as many of my students have, you will be sad to hear, or maybe glad to hear, that when you start working with the operations of a computer, there's a thing called precedence of operations in computers. So there are certain things that when you put in a line of code, there are certain things that have to be done in a certain sequence because some operations take precedence over the others. See, in arithmetic, multiplication and division takes precedence over addition and subtraction. This is a concept you need to get in your head, and especially if you want to control a computer and be a coder. So let's be motivated and let's learn the order of operations very well. Thank you. I'll see you with some examples in a little bit. Bye. As I was just saying, mnemonics help us to remember certain things that are easy to forget. And there is a mnemonic for the order of operations. And rather than abandon it, since it's so widely known, it's better that we straighten it out. Now, I mentioned the mnemonic that my arithmetic teacher gave us, and I think the problem is that sometimes students think that all mnemonics work like this. Mr. Bowden said, you want to learn how to spell arithmetic? Just learn this sentence. A rat in Tom's house might eat Tom's ice cream. One letter, one word, and you've got the spelling of arithmetic. Now, when we come to the mnemonic for the order of operations, like I said, when I learned it, it was my dear Aunt Sally from Mr. Cosgrove. But then when I started teaching, somewhere in the 4 years that I was not in high school, somebody added a please, my dear Aunt Sally, to talk about powers. And then somebody thought they'd even add more to that, to add parentheses. So you may have bumped into this mnemonic in one of these 3 ways. Probably, pretty please, my dear Aunt Sally. And my dog is going to try to bark at me. So please excuse her. But you can probably hear her panting in the background, even if you don't hear her bark. Anyway, I think the error comes, I know the error comes, is that students think that this mnemonic is like this one. They think that each of these words means something that they do. And this is where the mistake happens. It's not that way. See, they go multiply, divide, add, subtract. I hate to even write this down because this is all wrong. This is not the mnemonic. As I said before, multiplying and dividing are really the same operation. 2 names. One is for multiplying with the number itself, and dividing is multiplying with the reciprocal. And adding and subtracting are really the same operation. Subtraction is just adding the opposite. So this mnemonic, unlike the one for arithmetic, must be viewed in this way. You have to have multiply, divide, add, subtract. Do multiply and divide straight across as you bump into them. Then do add and subtract straight across as you bump into them. Now, of course, if there are parentheses or powers, they have precedence and have to be done first. Now let's look at a simple problem. I don't even want to work it out. My methods teacher said never work a problem incorrectly in front of them. But if you just look at this simple problem, if you don't have the order of operations correctly, and you thought it was this sort that's all wrong, multiply, divide, add, and subtract, you might think that the answer to this problem is 1, which it is not. This answer to this problem is 6 divide. You're going to do division and multiplication left to right as you find them. So you're going to do 6 divided by 2, which is 3, times 3, which is 9, the correct answer. If you were following this other thing, I'm not even going to show it because lest somebody look at the wrong part of this video. You can see that if you did multiplying first and then dividing, you get a completely different answer. And since there can only be one answer to a simple arithmetic problem like this, we have to have order of operations. This is why this topic is so very important. So memorize this, my dear Aunt Sally, but memorize it as 2 steps, multiply and divide. I don't know how to make that all. MD, add, subtract. Left to right as you find them, and then everything will be fine. Of course, if there had been an exponent in there, like a 2, you would have done the powers first, so it would have been 36 divided by 2 times 3. Which would be 18 times 3, which I'd have to, 18 3 8 is 24, 3, 54. So if there were powers in there, the powers would take precedence. Like I said, the problem is not with kids knowing that they have to do parentheses. You have to do parentheses first, then powers, then multiply and divide, and then add and subtract. I hope this helps you. Please work many examples till you're sure that you don't get them wrong. And maybe we can change the way things are happening on Facebook when people get the correct answer instead of the wrong answer so often. Thanks. Bye. Now let's look at some of the how-to programs that would be used to practice order of operations. I'm going to activate the how-to marker in case I have to do some calculations and don't have a piece of paper with me to work on. So I'm going to activate the marker. You may, if you don't understand what I'm saying here, you might want to look for the video on how to use the how-to marker. It's just a utility. Right here I'm going to press M to minimize it, and now go to where the program is for order of operations. Now, order of operations is not something that we're using the mystery X. Order of operations is something we should have learned before we started in on algebra, so it's located under foundational topics. I recommend two programs, this one right here that's order of operation, and then this one which is the quiz on the order of operations, which verges on child abuse for asking you questions that you need to know. I think that one of these mathos might also have something on it, but let's look at this order of operations here. I wanted to make it so that you could say what had to be done first. Click on the box with the operation that should be performed first. Then simplify the arithmetic. If you're just wanting to make sure that your reactions are right, you could skip the second command and just do this. If you can also press this if you need a reminder of what's what. So the first thing we want to do is click on the box with the operation that should be performed. So there's no multiplying and dividing, so we must add and subtract left to right, so adding would be right. If we wanted to do the rest of the problem, now we're going to have to work the arithmetic, so we would work this left to right. I guess I'm forcing you into answering the question. So what we want to do is we want to add 10 and 19. See, I would really like to tell you what we're doing, so here's where I can bring up the marker. I click on the marker, and the marker is going to take a screenshot of this, and so now I'm really into a drawing program. I'm no longer in my program. See, I can't really type anything in here. I can push clear and clear everything, but here we are into 10, so that would be 29 minus 9 is 20. Now I would really like to put the answer in here, but I can't do it this way. I can do it this way, but it won't be able to check because there's not any check button. So I have to remember this answer, press M to minimize the marker, and now put in the 20, and then check the arithmetic, and it says I'm correct. So now I'm ready for another problem. Which one would you do first? Which operation would you do first? In this case, it's not this plus, even though that's left to right, you have the precedent of the parentheses. So I'll bring the marker up so I can draw on here for you. So the first thing we're going to have to do is what's inside this parentheses, which is going to be 31. Now plus the 16. So I really want to say that I would do the subtraction first. And the answer would be 47. Let's see if I can remember that. So I'm going to minimize this and now answer. The first thing I would do is subtract. And my answer was 47. Check the arithmetic. Correct. New problem. Which one would be done first? It would be the division. Now I'd have to do that nasty arithmetic. Let's bring up the marker, show you that I'm not afraid of this. So we would want to do this division. 689. I'm going to make these all turn out to be kind of nice, so don't be too afraid. Divided by 13. Can't go 6, maybe it can't, 6 times? No. 5. 5 3s is 15, carry 1, 5. 65, 39, 3, so this is 53. So now I have negative 10 plus 53, which is going to be 43. 43. I'm in the marker, so it's not going to be any good to put 43 in here. So I'll push M to minimize. Now I have to say what I would do first, which would be the division. And what did I say? 43? I can't remember. Check the if I'm wrong now. I'm sorry. Oh, good. I remember. My short-term memory has not completely failed me. I hope you get the idea of how to use this program. You should practice it till you're never making a mistake on what's the order of operations. Thanks. Now let's end that one, and then let's look at this child abusey quiz. You type your name in here. The graffiti here is something that a student drew for me years and years ago. I persuaded him to draw it on paper instead of on the desk, and look, it made its way into this program. It was much better for him to draw it on paper and give it to me than to draw it on the desk, which required pollution to clean the desk off. So I'm going to use practice quiz because I have no desire to run this out the printer. Press begin. Now see, evaluate. This one, x is -8 and y is 10, and see these different things. It's really kind of virtually child abuse. But if you can make it through one of these quizzes and get 9 or 10 correctly, consistently, you probably have the rules in your mind and maybe are vulnerable to a careless mistake. So I can't draw on here, but I could bring the marker up, and you see it gives it the possibility to put this -8 in here. So this would be -8 minus 3 times 10. So what would have to be done first here is not this subtraction, but the multiplication. 3 times 10. So this would be -8 minus 30. So that should be -38. I could press M, minimize this, put the -38 in here, bring the marker back up again to do the next problem. What would have to be done first here would be this power, then this division. So this problem would end up being 2 plus 42 divided by 7 is 6 minus 4. So that would be 8 minus 4, 4. Press M, put my answer in 4, activate the marker, bring it back up again. If x is -2, 5 times -2 minus 2 would be -10 minus 2 is -12. Press M, put in the -12. I hope you get the idea. This program can be used over and over again, and the problems will change every time. There will always be one that has a fraction, something that has a cube, but these values that you plug in will change because it's all randomly generated. It gives you a chance to have a lot of practice. Now I'm just going to, because I don't, in the interest of time, just put some numbers in here. And when I press ready to check, the correct answers come up that are blank, and the ones that we look at guessing did not work. We got all these wrong. If I had had actual quiz, this whole thing would come out the printer graded, and I'd be able to like turn it into my teacher or something if that were an assignment. Okay, hope you have, I'm going to press end. Hope you have some skill at doing order of operations. If you have any trouble with your signed numbers or your multiplication facts, do some of these programs and remediate your arithmetic skills. Okay? Thanks. Bye.